The fear of deep water is, at least to me, the most justified irrational fear out there. Looking at images like this, seeing the depths water truly goes down to is a very scary thought, even to somebody who isn't afraid of deep waters. Thalassophobia is the fear of deep waters, which is pretty understandable. Most people stop at the simple fear of deep waters, but some go further. There are some hyper-specific fears related to water, but there is a fear of water that makes sense on a level that's hard to explain. It is a fear not of the water itself, but the contents of it. And not anything scary like sea creatures or large eldritch abominations just below our depths, but rather man-made objects, underwater. You may find things like submarines or shipwrecks cool, but some people would say otherwise. To a certain group of people, photos like these are absolutely terrifying. This condition, a condition that isn't as rare as you might expect, has often been referred to as submechanophobia. As you saw from the intro, submechanophobia is the fear of man-made objects or structures underwater. This can range from the underbelly of ships to flooded buildings. To someone without submechanophobia, this fear can seem rather irrational. I bet most people can at least understand thalassophobia. Being in an oceanic abyss like this would probably scare most people. The fear of submerged man-made objects, however, seems to be way too specific to be a fear that a large amount of people have. However, you would be wrong about that. The subreddit for submechanophobia has over 550,000 members, and videos showcasing it have millions of views, with comments explaining how they never knew this fear had a name. There is a clear community of people who fear submerged man-made objects. But why? What makes the fact that these things are submerged so much scarier than if they weren't? Well, I think a lot of it comes down to context. Images of submerged man-made objects are similar to liminal spaces in a way. Liminal spaces are transitional places devoid of people that feel nostalgic. Things like abandoned malls, hallways, and old office buildings, to name a few examples. At first glance, liminal spaces and submechanophobia seem to be completely different, so you might be confused as to why I bring this up. The reason I bring liminal spaces into this is because, just like submerged man-made objects, liminal spaces lack context. Just like it's weird to focus on a school hallway as anything more than a point of transition between two rooms, it's weird seeing man-made things in such a hostile environment that it wasn't designed for. A sort of uncanny feeling is present, mostly because submechanophobia depicts things underwater that shouldn't be, which is why I think it needs to be a man-made object specifically. It wouldn't be unusual to see a large rock or some coral underwater, but seeing something like a warning sign would certainly raise some questions. Why is it there? Who put it there? Until the fear of the unknown starts to set in. The fact that the ocean is so vast that our attempts to explore it with our meager land-made technology is ultimately futile. Nothing proves this inability to conquer the sea more than one of the biggest triggers of submechanophobia: shipwrecks. Shipwrecks are ways of the ocean telling us to know our place. They are a living proof of our inability to conquer the sea, but it's much more than that. As I said earlier, shipwrecks are a big trigger for submechanophobia, and it isn't hard to see why. No matter how advanced our seafaring technology gets, no matter how good we get at exploring the sea, our failures still elude us in the form of these underwater monsters. Oftentimes, these massive underwater ships get reclaimed by the ocean. Artificial reefs are usually what shipwrecks are destined to become. Artificial reefs are a phenomenon in which a ship or any other man-made structure underwater gets salvaged by the ocean. Fish use them as homes, reefs grow on their windows and their handrails. On a surface level, shipwrecks are almost sad, thinking about the people that once inhabited them. For ships lying in thousands of feet down in places we couldn't get to, it isn't hard to think about the fact that bodies could still be present in these shipwrecks, probably warped by the ocean's decay. On a deeper level, however, no pun intended, shipwrecks are a sign of how primitive we truly are when faced with the ocean. How our technology, no matter how advanced, is delicate in comparison to the ocean. It's a lot like outer space in that way. The men that went to the moon did so in a fragile tin can, being backed up by the computers with a combined total of 4 kilobytes of RAM, thousands of times less powerful than the phone in your pocket. Which makes me wonder, why isn't there a fear of man-made objects in space? I mean, the deep sea and the vast expanse of outer space aren't very different, So why does one phobia have millions of people backing it up and the other doesn't even exist? Because I think there's a big distinction between space exploration and deep sea exploration. Outer space is far from us. It's likely that nobody watching this video has ever been to outer space, but I bet the vast majority of you have visited the ocean. Humans and the ocean are a lot more intertwined than humans in outer space, so seeing ships destroyed at sea, or any other large object underwater for that matter, feels a lot more personal than, say, a video of Voyager 2 traveling through space. We like to think we know Earth pretty well, yet the oceans still remain a mystery to us. A fear of the unknown not caused by planets or stars, but by something right here on the very planet we call home, almost as if there were two worlds on one planet. And our attempts to breach into that other world and fill it with the structures we make in our own world, and failing to do so, is to me what the main root of submechanophobia is. If you don't have submechanophobia, it might be hard to see why people are so afraid of these things. But if you think about it rationally, deep oceans themselves are scary, but seeing something like a shipwreck or some old diving gear would certainly be a sign of danger. Why are these abandoned things just underwater like this? That's one of the main questions submechanophobia asks. And the simple fact that there are so many abandoned, decaying, man-made things down here gives off the feeling that you might be next. So there is a logical reason why people fear man-made objects underwater, in places like the deep ocean. But these places don't have to be natural in order to trigger submechanophobia. They can also be in places like abandoned, flooded buildings. I consider flooded buildings, especially abandoned ones, to be an almost subgenre of submechanophobia. It's not only one shipwreck or maybe a propeller underwater, it's instead a place, just like the place you're watching this video in, except underwater. To people with submechanophobia, that's a scary thought. There are many examples of flooded abandoned buildings. The New World Mall in Bangkok, Thailand being a good example of one of them. It was abandoned in 1994, and as of 2023, it is yet to be demolished. However, the roof was taken out, allowing rain to get in, flooding the building. The locals then decided to put fish in the water, and as of right now, it's a flooded abandoned mall that still harbors life in the form of fish. This mall has been posted multiple times on the Submechanophobia subreddit. There are many more examples of flooded abandoned buildings that can trigger submechanophobia, so clearly people with submechanophobia fear flooded places as well. But this fear of flooded places almost seems different compared to the fear of the deep ocean. Anthrophobia is the fear of floods and flooding. It's similar to submechanophobia in the way that it fears submerged man-made things, but it seems different. Most flooded buildings still fall under the category of submechanophobia, but I get an entirely different feeling seeing a flooded building than I do seeing a shipwreck. People have taken this combined fear of man-made things underwater and a fear of flooding and made things like the pool rooms. The pool rooms, or sometimes called the dream pools, are a part of an aesthetic called poolcore. They depict these dreamlike indoor pools. They can be comfortable, dreamlike, or maybe even a touch unsettling. The pool rooms are also very related to the backrooms. It even has a backrooms level dedicated to it. If you somehow haven't heard of the backrooms, they are an infinite array of mono-yellow hallways for you to get trapped in, with other levels that are rumored to exist. But the pool rooms are a lot more than a throwaway backrooms level. They have a big following on sites like Reddit, and you can see why. The concept of an infinite scape of rooms all partially flooded is terrifying enough, so it's not hard to see how this relates to submechanophobia. The backrooms are already a terrifying concept, so adding aquatic elements to it, like making these deep pools all around you, will naturally trigger submechanophobia. Designed in a way no human would ever think of if they wanted to practically design a pool. Sometimes these pools can go down way farther than a human can ever reach, and sometimes they can only be shallow enough to reach your knees. Sometimes the entirety of the image can be flooded. Sometimes it's only small sections. Either way, it's bizarre. And this bizarre, uncanny architecture, combined with the fear of these deep waters and the flooded areas, are what I think make the pool room such a popular topic when it comes to submechanophobia. Much like the backrooms themselves, it's hard to pinpoint the exact thing you should be afraid of in the pool rooms, yet there's always an unsettling feeling present. That combined with the lore of the pool rooms, the fact that these flooded areas go on forever in their strange fashion, is a big contributor to the overall vibe of the pool rooms. It's not hard to see why the pool rooms can trigger submechanophobia, but to me at least, I get much more fear from man-made objects in places like the ocean rather than just man-made pools. I'm not alone in this feeling either. Historically, submechanophobia has existed for thousands of years. Humans have always told stories of man-made things underwater, the most famous example being the rumored lost city of Atlantis. But there are proven great ancient cities that are now underwater, like the ancient Egyptian city of Thonis Heracleion. Thonis Heracleion used to be a great port city on the Mediterranean Sea, but now remains underwater. 64 ships, 700 anchors, and many 16-foot tall statues were discovered. Of course, this was an incredible discovery, but to think that this exists. 64 full-sized ships and statues, 3 times the size of a normal person, all existing underwater is a horrifying thought, even to someone without submechanophobia. I think this example of an underwater city with all these huge things is one of the first times I can completely relate to someone with submechanophobia. I don't think I have submechanophobia, but sometimes with examples like these, I seem to prove myself wrong. Just the thought that somewhere, these incredible artifacts of a civilization long forgotten exists, rotting away underwater, artificial reefs growing on the heads of statues from thousands of years ago. The ocean reclaiming something that was once ours. Submechanophobia or not, this is a scary thought. Our inability to control what happens to the things we create underwater is one of the many reasons you'll never catch me going into something like a submarine. A lone, man-made object in a vast ocean, and the thought of being inside one terrifies me. There have been many games that are scary, of course, but a lot of them take place on land. They take place in an environment we can control. But one of the scariest games I've ever played doesn't put you in a familiar environment. It instead bases its horror on the unfamiliar and the terrifying thought of being alone in a submarine. Iron Lung is one of, if not the scariest game I've ever played. It uses its environment and the fear of being in a submarine perfectly. The lore is pretty simple. Pretty much every single planet and star suddenly vanished in an event called the Quiet Rapture. The only humans that survived were those in spaceships, but for whatever reason, moons started appearing. Moons filled with oceans of blood. You are a convict of one of the spaceships that tasked you with exploring the blood oceans in a rickety, rusty submarine. A submarine that was not made for depths like these. And if you make it back, you get your freedom. Your task is to navigate to points of interest on a map and take photos. But instead of always knowing where you are on the map, you instead have to plot out your coordinates to tell you where you are. However, the entire time it feels like something is following you. You randomly get notifications from your solid object sensor that something is near your sub, but when you check the map, you realize that no walls are around you. Sometimes you get flung to parts of the map without warning, until you eventually take a picture of a point of interest and get greeted by this. You continue to venture to the last few points of interest. Your oxygen starts running low, pipes begin to burst, and fires start in the vessel. Once you start approaching the last point of interest, your submarine starts filling up with blood from the ocean outside. Then once you turn around to take a picture of the last point, this happens. Iron Lung is scary for many reasons, but I think the main one is the environment. It's a literal ocean of blood, which also brings out the fear of the unknown. The photos you take at the points of interest are also interesting. At first you see bones, then you start to see pipes, until eventually coming across what looks to be buildings fully submerged in this blood ocean. Who built these structures? Why are they here? Every picture you take, every groan of the submarine, every time your sensor goes off without any walls nearby to trigger it, it further adds to the fear of the unknown and makes you question your surroundings even more. A note on the ground in the Iron Lung reveals that you were never supposed to make it back. The only true way to have your freedom in a world without stars is to die down here on your own terms. Inside a lone, man-made submarine in a vast ocean of blood. Even as somebody without submechanophobia, this game is scary, but I imagine it would be even more terrifying to someone with submechanophobia. Alone in this vast ocean of blood. Not just far from any land, but far from anyone. Not just alone in the ocean, but alone on a celestial body covered in ocean. With the decay of what seems to be civilization and buildings. Unlike the games I usually review in these videos, Iron Lung isn't free. It's $6 on Steam. Even if I spoiled some of it here, I recommend it. Especially if you have submechanophobia. Because it's such a unique idea that hasn't yet been explored. As always, a link to the Steam page will be left in the description. Another thing that can trigger submechanophobia is underwater animatronics. There are plenty of examples of theme parks and rides featuring animatronics underwater, It's a big branch of submechanophobia. Searching up submechanophobia animatronics on YouTube yields videos with millions of views, with some people even thinking submechanophobia is the fear of underwater animatronics, even though it isn't. And it isn't hard to see why. The fear of animatronics makes a lot more sense to most people than the fear of man-made things underwater. But by combining the two, you can make the submechanophobia aspect even worse. Not only is it a man-made thing underwater, but it's also an animatronic. It feels alive, yet is artificial. Animatronics and synthetic robots already look and feel uncanny with their robotic movements and lack of consciousness, so you would see why putting them in an out-of-context place, for example, underwater, would be scary. It's almost double uncanny, the uncanniness of the animatronic mixed in with the uncanniness of man-made objects underwater. My favorite being this giant animatronic squid in Disneyland Paris. I think even to people without submechanophobia, animatronics underwater are still a fairly scary thought. These lifeless, yet moving robots mixed in with the mysteriousness of water makes underwater animatronics feel almost like a monster in the dark, even when it isn't meant to scare. Submechanophobia is one of those fears that people misrepresent. It's not a fear of one man-made thing underwater in particular, it's not a fear of animatronics underwater, nor is it the fear of shipwrecks. It's every man-made thing you can think of, from flooded abandoned buildings to shipwrecks, to lost ancient civilizations far below our depths. Submechanophobia, though initially an odd fear, is perfectly explainable, and makes sense after you really analyze what makes people fear man-made objects underwater. It's no wonder why submechanophobia has so many people backing it up on sites like Reddit and YouTube. So the next time you find yourself at a Disney ride with aquatic themes, or viewing an image of a shipwreck in the pitch blackness of the ocean, and you feel a little bit creeped out, just remember, maybe it's not the water that scares you. Maybe it's the viewing of our creations in the domain of the water. A domain that might as well be another world. A world we were never meant to visit. A world where our mere existence trespassing in it is terrifying. And the fact that our creations, try as they like, can never truly breach the horrors of the water.